This is going to be a short clarification of an argument that I finished the previous uh, audio lecture making. Um, so, in the previous section in this series on Eudaimonistic egoism, I covered why I think there actually exists a certain ultimate end or desire that actually um, meets that actually satisfies best the criteria that I think ethics needs to fulfill um, in comparison to anything else. And I also, gave an argument for it having certain properties and concluded that something which satisfies all those properties might best be called happiness or alternatively fulfillment. The final argument I made, however, was an attempt to describe, using some evolutionary psychology and biology, what I actually think constitutes this happiness. Essentially, approaching understanding this desire from the other end, from the sort of empirical end instead of the more introspective, rationalistic end, aspect. I'm not particularly happy with how I phrased or worked out that argument, however, and I didn't really cover many of its nuances or possible objections to it in a way that I found satisfactory when given time to think about it. So after discussing this with one of my friends who knows more about evolution than I do, and attempting to work with him to refine my phrasing of the argument, I decided that it would be best to release a correction to the previous video, as I'm attempting to make as much a habit as possible of correcting and improving myself wherever possible, since I don't want to become complacent in my already existing beliefs, simply because there's no one really around dedicated to criticizing them. So, let me put forward the new version of this argument. So, to begin with, most complex faculties that biological organisms evolve over time require a lot of extra complexity and therefore extra energy to grow, and therefore it's you know it's very unlikely that a complex extra faculty, such as extra legs and extra arms or extra sensory organs or regular organs or extra mental capacity, it's unlikely that any of that would develop and then stick around if it was not beneficial to survival in some way. This means that it is very likely that all of the capacities that a organism has in a sort of evolutionary, like in a time of equilibrium, are likely to be there because they are selected because they aid in survival and ultimately reproduction. And importantly, this actually explains the sort of teleological appearance of all of the organs and faculties and components of these biological organisms. Because if you have an iterated system where new things are generated and then only those that fit a certain criteria are allowed to continue into the next generation, then if you look at each individual set of these organs or whatever they are, these properties, it will look like they've all been selected for a purpose, because they have actually been selected only if they do a certain thing, i.e. serve a certain purpose. However, in evolution, the selection criteria is also the selection process itself, because the things are only selected to be put into the next generation of sets of properties if they are, they actually propagate themselves by aiding in the survival and reproduction of the whole creature. But, and so, but importantly, it's not about the thing, the individual property perpetuating itself by itself. It depends on the other components of the creature, the whole biological organism. And so the selection criteria is essentially whether it can ensure that the creature survives to reproduce with that property piggybacking on it. And so this is another reason to say that basically all the faculties that a biological organism has are very likely, especially in an equilibrium stage, to be there because they aid survival. Another reason is because most complex faculties or capacities actually require multiple mutations and multiple genes in order to arrive at, which means that each individual step has to persist and spread, which means that each individual step that leads up to the development of that faculty also has to be beneficial to survival in some way, if not in exactly the same way as the finally developed faculty is. And so, that means that, everything that leads up to the faculty has to aid survival in some way. So now, this might seem to indicate that since the purpose of all the faculties we have is to survive and reproduce, that our ultimate end should be survival and reproduction, and that is what we should be optimizing for. However, simply because something is actually the, apparent teleological goal of something does not mean it should be used for that thing necessarily. There has to be actually a motivation for us to do that. And our reward centers, I will argue, actually aren't oriented to reward us directly for reproduction and long-term survival. Because survival and especially reproduction are essentially properties about the external world, propositions about the external world, and as such, they are very difficult to encode directly into biology, since a biological organism only has direct access to its internal state, and any access to anything external requires both sensory organs, nerves, and then something to process that information. And so if reproduction or long-term survival were to be directly coded for by evolution, then every single organism would have to have a fairly complex brain, almost approaching that of a human, in order to do that. So instead, and additionally, coding directly for survival and reproduction is difficult because that's an end goal, not a plan. It's like a good analogy for this would be, let's say a boardroom meeting is convened for a company, and they're trying to figure out how to make more profits. If the chair and everyone immediately concluded, okay, our plan to make more profits is make more profits, that's really not helpful because they don't actually know how to get there. And if what they do instead is set out a list of things that need to be done, possibly repeatedly, and then give incentives to complete them and disincentives for not completing them, that's a real plan. That's something that's actionable and that might actually work. In the same way, if a biological organism through evolution develops somehow a motivation only for survival and reproduction, but but doesn't develop a plan, it would need, a human-like brain in order to actually rationally plan it out itself. And even then, it wouldn't really be possible, right? Instead, the simpler way, and the much more efficient way, because it gives most of the same effect, but requires far less complexity, is to directly give the organism incentives and disincentives so that it's more likely to do the things that help it survive. And what are these things that help it survive? Using the capacities that themselves are only developed because having them aids survival. And so that means that the most evolutionarily natural and efficient in an evolutionary sense way to ensure an organism's survival is to code for rewards directly for using the faculties that that organism has developed, because it's developed those faculties or capacities because it helps survival and reproduction. So to give an example, if we take like a rabbit, right? A rabbit is more likely to be able to survive, or only really able to survive at all if it's capable of running. And it's still more likely to survive the more motivated it is to use that capacity to run, since that capacity to run itself helps survival within certain limits. And so this means that because it's difficult and inefficient and not particularly helpful to code for survival and reproduction directly, and evolution is going to give a creature the capacities that help it survive, it's instead better to code directly for doing things that help it survive by coding directly for the use of those capacities. And so this is why I think that it's likely that if we want to optimize the actual happiness that we get, we need to optimize not for the ultimate, goal that kind of motivates everything evolution does, but instead optimize for the proxies that evolution actually uses to approximate those ultimate goals. Because we don't ultimately necessarily care about long-term survival and reproduction. We have definitely been given these reward functions as proxies, and so we can just optimize those and not worry about survival and reproduction unless we want to, because it's like we can essentially game the system, right? There's the ultimate goal that these incentives were supposed to guide us towards, but those incentives don't necessarily have to force us to that goal. Maybe we can optimize the incentives by doing something else. Importantly, though, there are incentives and disincentives to using faculties. So, because using faculties too much would actually go against the survival of an organism, right? If a rabbit ran all the time, it would die of exhaustion and so on, or starve. And so we actually, we as humans, when we are trying to fulfill and use our faculties, we actually have to be aware not to use them so much that they're to the detriment of our reward function for that faculty, or to the detriment of other faculties, such that the overall, reward that we get is decreased. So it's sort of like a multivariate optimization problem where we need to find that sort of optimal point where we're using our faculties as close to optimal as possible in a way that allows us to optimize the other use of the other faculties as much as possible. And even the right, and so yeah, and then even the individual faculties don't actually have to be used in the setting within which they were developed and within which they actually aided survival. So just like we don't have to necessarily optimize our reward function by taking advantage of our natural incentive structure by going for the things that the incentives were a proxy for. In individual cases, we don't have to optimize the incentive rewards that we get from using a faculty by using it in a way that aids survival, even though that's what that's the reason why the faculty was developed and the reward function was therefore developed for it. So, for instance, if I want to run or walk because humans are actually endurance hunters, and so walking is good for us, or we're designed to walk for long distances with great amounts of endurance. That doesn't mean that I have to pick up my spear, fly to Africa, and go hunt some gazelle in the savannah. Instead, I can just put on my sneakers and walk outside and walk around in my urban environment, because that will still give the reward function the same benefit, even though it's not being used in the original way. And this is important to note because, so I'm stressing the idea that we don't have to optimize for the ultimate goal for which the incentive structures we were given were attempting to be a proxy for, both on the individual level and on the aggregate level. Because a lot of people think that, if evolution is true and if we're going to be bringing the ideas of evolution into ethics, that must automatically mean that we become like wolves or something, where, or not, maybe not wolves, but some kind of, rabid, social Darwinistic creature where we are focused only on propagating our genes as much as possible. Because the fact is that won't actually, even though that's essentially what evolution is attempting to make a proxy for, that's actually not where our incentive structure is optimized at. Because the incentives are just proxies. They're just a quick and dirty, coding, because coding directly for survival and reproduction would be far too complicated and prone to error, and also lacking a plan then. And so instead we have these proxies that don't necessarily optimize for that. Yeah, and so this is sort of why I think that it makes sense that our happiness, as described in the previous section, would actually be constituted in developing and using these faculties that we have. Because essentially, they're developed only because they help us survive and reproduce. And that's like sort of the whole quote-unquote goal of evolution. And so the most efficient way to increase our chances of survival and reproduction is to place incentives and disincentives on those faculties so that we use them more, because they by definition help us survive. So to use them helps us survive even more. Yeah. So I think that's it for this one.